So this is case 1, Abhayudaya Revitalizing Community. In 2000, the Jeffrey Summit, Rabbi Jeffrey Summit, approached the Smithsonian Folkways with quite an extraordinary collection, a recording of religious music, so Jewish religious music of his community. And while Folkways said, I think it was Atesh Sonneborn, the associate director, who looked at the material, it was beautifully documented. The music was extraordinary, apparently, but he said to be a really good Folkways album and subscribe to the idea of cultural documentation the way the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage had, at least in terms of its mission, it really had to address not just the religious music of that community, but the range from all the activities of the community, including lullabies, political work songs, funerary songs, etc., etc. So he went back. Jeff Summit went back, raised the funds, did another round of field research, years, and came back with what Folkways and the folks who were reviewing it said was an extraordinary documentation and music collection, which through local Ugandan music, rich choral singing, Afro-pop, 19th century European music, and traditional drummers. They hadn't heard anything like this. And I'm going to play a clip for you later on, and I've written down that they won the Grammy Award for Best Traditional World Music Album, not because I think that's a prize or an award or a sanction of any form, but it means that the recording industry recognized a certain kind of standard that Folkways was trying to achieve. And more importantly, for our perspective here, the point I'm trying to bring home is that the royalties from this music, this was again returned to them, funded 19 university scholarships for the community. This is one way in which you can think about a return of some sort, a material return. 2000, so that happened. And then after 9/11, one of the community organizers of Abhayudaya, J.J. Keki, was so upset that something had been done in the world, in the name of one of the world's great religions, that he decided to do something about it. And he had been part of the earlier CD, but he decided to go back to Uganda and put together an interfaith. He wanted to do something in the name of religion, but the opposite, right? Not for conflict, for peace. So he goes back and he founds interfaith coffee cooperative with his Christian and Muslim neighbors, calls it Delicious Peace, Mirembe Kawamera. And that is quite extraordinary, because look at what you began with. You began with a recording of a religious life of one community as put forward by a third-party compiler, and there was a contract already in place between the compiler and the Smithsonian for that. And this is going to come. The second CD is going to come out in 2012, but it has about, the cooperative itself has about 1,000 farmers that sing and speak and work toward women's empowerment, environmental education, fair trade. All of their coffee is sold at fair trade prices. So it's economically, it's kind of an interesting model. But the album itself has 300 farmers from the cooperative singing on themes ranging from fair trade to agriculture. And in the documentation and the liner notes that go with Delicious Peace, it's peppered by the community. I've included a quote from the Abhayudaya school headmaster, who really said, we have been saved by our music just in terms of our cultural identity. So we were able to actually come together and do something socially and materially for this now expanded community. Notice that even the definition of community has been changed in some way by this particular form of return. And I think to show you that Little clip from Delicious Piece, which is going to be released this year, so you got a preview. But I thought it was interesting to kind of include the fact that it was not, they say they've been changed. I want to bring this up at the end. The definition of community is actually a very difficult thing here to actually think about in terms of benefit sharing, because benefit sharing is one way in which returns are thought about. Moving along, so that's sort of one way in which one group, Folkways dealt with one group. Second one, Bosavi, the Kaluli people from Papua New Guinea. Here, it's a really interesting case of what one curator was calling the extraordinary gesture of the compiler, because Stephen Feld, an anthropologist, who worked for 20 years in the Bosavi rainforest and was very dedicated to, again, recording the entire sounds of the rainforest, including not only the music, but the sounds themselves, worked with Mickey Hart of the Grateful Dead to actually set up, to release the first CD and then set up this fund, this NGO, this non-governmental organization called the Bosavi People's Fund. And the fund determined how the royalties would be spent, financed the school clinics, re-release of the 3 CD set, which I'm going to play you a clip from, of Bosavi music on Folkways. And this is an extraordinary collection because it's an intimate portrait of every aspect of the community's life over the 20 years that he's been doing this work. And what Feld did was the royalties from not only the recordings, but the publications of his book went back into the Bosavi People's Fund, and the community had full, complete control over what they wanted to do with it. And what they chose to do with it was create a Bosavi digital archive to digitize not only the music, but the music that had been already compiled, but new music. They have something called a new music room that they've created in the heart of the jungle, of the rainforest, that the younger generation wanted to create new music with. So they're actually using various versions of Australian pop and drumming to include with this, and it's all there on the 3 CD collection. And this, I think, because it's similar to the Abu Yudaya case, but it's also slightly. So that's an initiation rite that was done by the elder generation of the Bosavi. And then with that, I just wanted, to give you a sense of how different some of them were. But the CD itself is quite extraordinary, both as ethnomusicologists say and in terms of the documentation that's involved. The other 2 cases that I want to actually talk about today have to do not with how material rewards were redistributed back to the community, but notions of rights of access. Should these recordings be in the public domain or not? And what are the rights of secrecy and privacy over whether or not the community wanted them heard in the first place. The first one is Western Australian Desert Aborigine case, and the people, it was recorded in 1966. So here again, the history of Folkways is interesting because many of the recordings that we're dealing with were actually almost 50, 60 years old, and you had to go back to the recordists and the anthropologists and the notes to look at really what, and the current contemporary wishes of the community over whether or not they wanted their ancestors' voices either heard in the public domain or not. So, and there are two ways in which they decided. We decided to actually include two cases which have contrasting ways in which they handled this. The first one was, at least half of them included male initiation rites and songs. Now, in Australia, in many parts of the world, but especially in this, the Nyantha Jara people are actually not a tribe, but they're a linguistic group of Pitanjara language. But half of this particular CD included male initiation rites, which were restricted to only the initiates themselves, and certainly not to people of the opposite gender, sometimes with very harsh penalties if in fact they happened to witness them. So this was there, it was up, it was a recording, it was publicly accessible, you could access it in the archive, you could listen to it. Then in 2006, Folkways was approached by the tribal council chair, who had spoken to an anthropologist who questioned the propriety of public availability of these recordings. So the museum at first navigated this legally in an interesting way. They thought about, by U.S. free speech laws and copyright laws and the contract with the actual the recording, what would a 12-year-old girl in Midwestern USA, shouldn't she have the rights to actually listen to some of this, because it was a U.S. recording? So they approached it from in that direction. And then they consulted Jane Anderson, who at that time was in the Australian Institute of the Aborigine and Torres Strait Islander group, to go and consult with the communities and recordings and find out what was happening. They had a series of consultations, and what they found was really interesting. They found that it was restricted not just to women, but to everyone. That is, in Australia, it would not have ever been available. The original recordist, R.A. Gold, was contacted, and he immediately agreed that the album should be taken out of print. So it is, and so it remains right now. The Smithsonian, you can make an appointment, and there's an elaborate procedure by which you can actually access some of the field notes, but the recording itself has been taken out of print, and you cannot access it. So it's kind of the return of control is easy in theory, but it's very difficult in practice, because meanwhile there had been, I think they weren't even clear on how many CDs had already been issued and sold and sent out, disseminated. So how do you think about recall, when you have to do it retrospectively like this? And how do you respect the balance, balance the respect for privacy, which the community might want, with the request to study them, if it is in the U.S. National Museum, and this is about documentation and all of that. So this was, but the way that Folkways decided this was that this was clearly an egregious case which should not have ever been publicly available, and they retracted it, so it's not available. A completely different approach, a completely different response was found in the Peotist Church. Do you know the Peotist churches are, the Peotist movement was introduced into the Native American churches of Nevada and California and Oklahoma, where the belief is that the peyote plant, which is a peyote cactus, smoking it actually gives you a sacred visions, and some of the and ceremonial songs and open prayer meetings that take place in the church are often done under the influence of peyote, which is already a very complicated issue in terms of drug use in the U.S. But the Smithsonian Folkways had two Peotist church recordings. One was, again, similarly to the Australian case, the Washoe peyotes, they were captured, and they call these song captures. So the recordings were often done under the influence of peyote at open prayer meetings. The recording was actually in 1954. In 2004, again, through an anthropologist and through meetings with the Folkways, the Washoe wanted their recording taken out of the archive. So Smithsonian complied. And because of that, Atish Sonneborn, one of the curators at Folkways, then thought this might apply to the other Peyotes church. So he goes back to that other propriety. He goes back to actually explore some of the issues involved in the Kiowa Peyotes church, which I can play for you. But he approached them. It was very difficult to actually approach them because he had to find the current tribal chair, call the consultations, do it, I think, over Skype. And here the difference was that the songs were sung in casual, not ceremonial cycles, sometimes in trucks and hotel rooms. So that was the big difference in terms of they were under the influence of peyote, but it was not in ceremonial cycles. So the tribal council chief was consulted, and the response went in completely the opposite direction. They wanted full public access, precisely because, and I love this quote, Ronald Topfi says, 100 years from now, we want our children's children to hear this music. So, of course, it's in, and it just shows you that there are no easy answers. And this is an initiation rite. Cases sort of give you different ways in which to even raise questions about the music returns process. I'm sorry. Is there, and at the end, when you look at them collectively, the question that is raised is there anything, if even within one genre, one archive, one church, there are differences in how to think about secrecy, community, identity. How does one even begin to come up with a one-size-fits-all? One cannot, but how can one begin to theorize the question of returns? And are, in fact, the gaps and the fault lines and the case-by-case way in which precedent is built the only way to do something like this? Is it as important as consensus? When we began to talk about this and we were thinking about all of the complications, legal and cultural and from a museological point of view, what struck us was that it really raises questions about the music returns process, the recording process, but also the returns process. And I think each of these cases raises different questions itself. The Abayudaya community was changed by their music and the recording and the return and what they wanted to do with it. With the Bosavi, it becomes how does a museum step in to do with the responsibility to do the kinds of things that particular compiler, which was left to his discretion to do, and how to define traditional knowledge at all. Can it be saved? Should it be saved? With the Western Australian desert Aborigines, it's really who controls rights over access. Is it the elders of the community? Is it the contemporary, the younger generation? Should they have had access to the voices of the ancestors, as happened in the Peyotes church? And really it's about sacred knowledge, but it's also about how you're thinking about, knowledge going back to the communities in terms of context. In the end, I think if one thinks about recordings as not just information, as again back to the social capacity of song, maybe we can make a beginning at coming to things like the mission of the Smithsonian, which is an archive of the people, by the people, for the people. They say this now and then. Maybe that the first step can be made when you think about the entire range of what a song or a recording can do. If maybe does one have an ethical duty to give back some of that, to redistribute it ethically, so that the community could reuse it, revitalize it in ways that they chose. I want to end there. There's much more to say, but I think these are both concrete things that emerge case by case, but also are abstract enough that they need to be talked about. And part of it is really just raising some of these questions rather than actually resolving all of the answers. So I want to actually leave it loose-ended and end there and welcome questions and talk about what happened, where it came from, where this is going. Is this, and what does Folkways have in mind for something else?